It was my 65th birthday, a day I thought would be filled with laughter, hugs, and the scent of my favorite lemon cake. Instead, I found myself sitting alone in the lobby of Rosewood Pines nursing facility. The birthday balloon tied to my wrist felt like a cruel joke. The woman at the front desk smiled politely. I smiled back, trying not to cry. 2 hours earlier, my children had brought me here under the pretense of taking me out for a surprise celebration. My daughter Emma had even gone as far as picking out a new dress for me. My son Alex was unusually kind, helping me with my coat and guiding me gently down the steps of our family home. I should have known something was wrong. There had been too many goodbyes that morning, disguised as casual smiles. When we arrived at Rosewood, I was confused. This wasn't a restaurant. It certainly wasn't a party venue. My children didn't make eye contact as the staff took my suitcase. My suitcase. I turned to them, a lump forming in my throat. "What is this?" I asked, already fearing the answer. Emma looked away. Alex cleared his throat and said, "Mum, it's time. You'll be better off here. It's for your own good." "For my own good?" I repeated, my voice barely more than a whisper. They didn't say much after that. They hugged me quickly, coldly, like they were brushing past a stranger, and then they left. I stood there in the wide, open space, surrounded by plastic smiles and antiseptic air, wondering when exactly my children had stopped seeing me as a person. A nurse with kind eyes led me to my room. She spoke softly, trying to make small talk, but I couldn't process a word. My ears were full of the silence they left behind. My children, my only family, the ones I had sacrificed everything for. Later that evening, I sat at the edge of my narrow bed, staring out the window of my small, impersonal room. The night sky outside was beautiful, but I had no one to share it with. A soft knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. It was Mrs. Jenkins, a sprightly 80-year-old with a sharp glint in her eyes. "First day?" she asked. I nodded. "They all cry the first day," she said. "Some never stop, but you look like the type who will." I didn't respond. I didn't know what type I was anymore. I had been a mother, a wife, a teacher. Now I was just another old woman waiting out the end in a borrowed bed. That night I couldn't sleep. My thoughts wouldn't stop racing. I kept replaying the moment I was left here, trying to spot the signs I'd missed, the cold glances, the growing impatience, the way they always had an excuse not to visit, and in that quiet despair, a memory surfaced. It was a cold winter night. Alex had the flu. I stayed up all night by his side, holding a bowl while he vomited, singing lullabies to soothe him. Emma had once fallen off her bike when she was 8. She cried for hours, and I carried her up the stairs even though my back was screaming in pain. I gave them everything. My time, my money, my youth. I worked 2 jobs when their father left. I skipped meals so they could eat. I wore the same coat for 5 winters straight, just so they wouldn't feel the sting of poverty. And when I had nothing left but memories and grey hair, they gave me this, Rosewood Pines. I wiped the tears from my cheeks and stared at the ceiling. "I am not done," I whispered, "not by a long shot." Back when the house was still filled with noise and warmth, I used to believe we were the perfect little family. Every Saturday morning I would make pancakes in the kitchen while Alex and Emma argued over cartoons. I would pretend to be annoyed, but deep down I loved it. The chaos meant life. I had married young and lost my husband even younger. He walked out when Emma was just 5 and Alex 7, leaving behind nothing but a pile of unpaid bills and empty promises. I was 33 with no job, no savings, and 2 mouths to feed. I remember sitting on the kitchen floor after he left, holding a bill in one hand and Emma's sticky popsicle in the other, wondering how I'd survive. But I did. I pulled myself up, dusted off the grief, and went to work, literally. I worked 2 jobs, morning shift at the school cafeteria and nights cleaning offices. I was never home long enough to feel tired. There were days my hands would shake from exhaustion, but I still packed their lunches with notes saying, "I love you," and attended every school play, even if I had to stand in the back wearing my janitor uniform. I taught them how to ride bikes, how to be kind, how to stand tall, even when life tried to push them down. Emma used to climb into bed with me after nightmares. Alex would come home from school, dump his bag, and talk non-stop about video games while I cooked dinner. I'd smile and nod, even when I didn't understand a word. I was their safe place, their anchor, and they were my world. When they both graduated from college, Alex in engineering, Emma in graphic design, I felt like I had crossed a finish line barefoot, bloody, and breathless. I remember Alex's graduation ceremony. He looked so handsome in that cap and gown. I sat in the front row, tears running down my cheeks, and when he stepped down from the stage, he whispered, "I did it, Mum, because of you." Emma was no different. After her first job offer, she ran home with takeout and a bottle of cheap wine. We danced in the living room, barefoot and giddy. I thought, finally, they've made it, I can rest, but resting never came. The calls started getting shorter, the visits less frequent. Emma got engaged, and I only found out through a social media post. Alex moved to another city for work and barely returned my messages. I told myself they were busy, that I had done my job so well they didn't need me anymore. I told myself this until the loneliness became a quiet scream in my heart. On my 60th birthday, they threw a surprise party. I was so happy that day, so foolishly content. They gave me a travel brochure and said, "It's time for you to enjoy life now." I believed them. But slowly, things shifted. I began to feel like a guest in their lives, not a mother. When my knees started aching and I needed more rest, they sighed. When I forgot something small, they exchanged worried glances. I heard Alex whisper once, "What if she gets worse?" I ignored it, until the day they brought me to Rosewood Pines. The betrayal wasn't sudden. It was a slow, creeping erosion of love and memory, of connection turning to duty, and then finally to avoidance. They didn't hate me. They had just outgrown me. I was no longer useful, no longer needed. And that, more than anything, broke me, because all I ever wanted was to be there for them, to be their mother, not a burden, not a problem to be solved. I used to think love guaranteed loyalty, that if I gave enough, sacrificed enough, I would always have a place in their hearts. But life, I was learning, doesn't work like that. Sometimes the people you pour your soul into are the first to walk away when the pouring stops. That realization didn't come with fireworks, it came with silence, and in that silence I began to plan. If they could turn the page on me so easily, then maybe, just maybe, I could write a whole new chapter for myself, one where I wasn't just a forgotten mother in a nursing home, but something more, something unexpected. My 65th birthday began like any other day. I woke up expecting nothing more than a quiet morning with my tea, maybe a phone call or two from the kids. But to my surprise, both Alex and Emma showed up unannounced, smiling brightly and carrying a cake. I almost cried from happiness. Alex kissed my cheek and Emma hugged me tightly, whispering, "We've planned something really special for you, Mum." They sat me down at the dining table, lit the candles and sang off-key like they used to when they were little. I closed my eyes and made a wish, the kind you never say out loud but feel in every cell of your being. I wished for time, for more memories, for them to see me again, not just as an aging woman but as their mother. After we had a slice of cake, they exchanged a quick glance before Alex cleared his throat. "We've been thinking, Mum," he began carefully. "You've spent your whole life taking care of us. It's time someone takes care of you now." Emma nodded, her smile stretched tight. "There's this place we found. It's beautiful, peaceful. They have gardens, art classes, music nights. It's like a little resort." I didn't understand at first. I thought they were offering a weekend getaway, but then Alex stood up and pulled out a printed brochure from his backpack. It was glossy and filled with pictures of happy old people doing yoga, painting, laughing around fireplaces. "Rosewood Pines," he said. "We've already scheduled your check-in." "Today." My hands froze. "Today?" I repeated, voice barely a whisper. Emma reached over and held my hand. "It'll be good for you, Mum. You'll have people your age to talk to, and we'll visit all the time." My tea turned cold, the slice of cake in my mouth tasted like ash. I looked around my home, the photos on the walls, the curtains I had sewn myself, the plants I watered every morning. "Why today?" I asked. Alex shifted uncomfortably. "It's your birthday. We thought it would be symbolic. A new chapter." I forced myself to breathe slowly. "Am I sick? Do I need medical care?" "No, of course not," Emma said quickly. "But you're getting older. You live alone. What if you fall or forget something?" "This is safer," That word safer was like a blade. You mean easier? Easier for you. Silence stretched between us like a wall. Alex sighed, already impatient. Mum, we've thought this through. Everything's arranged. The movers are coming next week for your things. We packed an overnight bag. I stood up slowly, afraid my knees would buckle. So I don't have a choice. Emma's eyes filled with tears. Don't make this harder than it has to be. We love you. We just want what's best. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I just walked to my bedroom, picked up the bag they'd packed, and followed them out. The ride to Rosewood Pines was silent. I sat in the back seat while they chatted softly in the front. The road curved through neighborhoods I used to know, then past the city limits into a quieter, greener space that felt nothing like home. The building was beautiful. I couldn't deny that. The gardens were neatly trimmed and the lobby smelled like lavender. A nurse welcomed me with a clipboard and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Welcome, Helen. We're so glad you're here. I wanted to run. Instead, I signed the forms, pretending I didn't notice Emma and Alex avoiding eye contact. After the tour, they stood by the door making promises. We'll visit every week, Emma said. Call us if you need anything, Alex added. I nodded, hugged them both, and smiled like I believed them. When the door finally closed, I stood in the hallway of my new life, holding that same overnight bag. My room was clean, tidy, impersonal. A bed, a dresser, a window overlooking a courtyard. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. I was 65, and they had just discarded me like expired milk. What hurt wasn't the move, it was the ease with which they did it, as if I were a burden they were relieved to release. That night, I cried for the first time in years, not for myself, but for the woman who once held 2 babies in her arms and believed love alone would be enough. I thought of all the birthday candles I'd blown out over the decades, all the wishes I'd made for my children's happiness. And now here I was, alone on my own birthday, left in a place that felt more like a finish line than a new beginning. But as I lay there in the quiet, something inside me began to harden. They thought they had written the end of my story, but they had no idea what was coming. The first week at Rosewood Pines was a blur of introductions, tour guides, and polite strangers telling me how lucky I was to be here. My room was tidy, my meals were on time, and the nurses were cordial. But everything felt hollow. I wasn't a guest, I was warehoused. A soft-spoken woman named Carol lived in the room across from mine. She had been a high school teacher and still wore cardigans like she was heading to class. We shared meals sometimes, made small talk about books and television. She had been in Rosewood for 3 years. When I asked her how often her kids visited, she looked down at her soup and said, "Not since Christmas 2 years ago." That told me everything I needed to know. I began to observe the place more closely. I noticed who got visitors and who didn't, who cried themselves to sleep and who smiled through the ache. Most of the residents had families who promised they'd visit often, then slowly forgot. I refused to be one of those quietly vanishing women. I might have been pushed aside, but I wasn't finished. Every day I rose early, dressed neatly, and walked the perimeter of the garden. I watched staff shift rotations. I learned which nurses talked too much, which ones snuck cigarettes behind the back porch. I took notes, not on paper but in memory. People underestimated older women. They assumed we were fading. That was their first mistake. The second week, I asked the activities director if there was a computer I could use. He smiled and led me to a small media room with 2 dusty desktops. "Not many residents use them," he said, handing me the password. I thanked him and returned each day, spending quiet hours typing. Not browsing the internet like they assumed, but documenting everything: my treatment, the conditions of the facility, the funding, the management contracts. I requested a copy of the resident handbook and carefully compared its promises to what was actually delivered. There were discrepancies. Big ones. One afternoon, Carol leaned over and whispered, "What are you always working on?" I smiled. "A little project." She nodded as if that answer made sense. I started researching who owned Rosewood Pines. Turns out it was part of a larger network of senior living facilities, all managed by the same corporate investment firm. Their website was filled with glossy promises, photos of laughing seniors holding paintbrushes, happy testimonials. But what I saw every day didn't match that fantasy. Leaky faucets went unfixed for weeks. The meals were getting cheaper. Staff were clearly overworked. I watched one nurse get scolded for spending too long helping a resident in distress. The priorities were clear: profits first, people second. One night I found the CEO's name buried in a financial disclosure report. I wrote it down. A week later, I sent an anonymous letter to a local investigative reporter, attaching all the information I had compiled. I didn't sign my name, not yet. Meanwhile, I played the part they expected. I attended bingo nights. I smiled at the director. I let Emma and Alex believe everything was fine. They called twice in the first month, then once, then silence. I stopped waiting. I started preparing. I had a small locked drawer where I kept copies of every document I had collected. I wrote a detailed account of what had happened to me, how my children had moved me in without consent, how they hadn't followed any legal advice or obtained medical clearance. My neighbour's daughter was a lawyer, and during one of her visits I managed to ask a few questions casually. She gave me more than she realised. I began piecing together something much bigger than my personal heartbreak. This wasn't just about being abandoned. This was about how people like me, older, invisible, dismissed, were being treated like clutter to be managed. I wasn't going to go quietly. I was going to expose everything. Every day I grew more focused. The sadness didn't leave, but it sharpened into purpose. I even asked to volunteer in the front office under the pretense of keeping busy. They agreed, flattered that a resident would want to help. That gave me access to even more documents, even more cracks in the glossy surface. By the end of month 2, I had everything I needed. Now it was just a matter of timing. Timing and one final move. They thought they had removed me from the game, but they had no idea that I wasn't done playing. In fact, I was just getting started. It was a quiet Thursday morning when everything shifted. I was sipping coffee in the common room, pretending to be immersed in the knitting circle's gossip, when a new staff member entered the building. He was younger than most, maybe early 30s, with a tablet under one arm and a calm, observant expression. He introduced himself briefly as Noah, part of an auditing team reviewing facility compliance. The activities director gave him a tight-lipped smile and quickly ushered him toward the administrator's office. Most residents barely noticed. I did. That afternoon, while I was volunteering in the office, I watched Noah move between files, reviewing charts, checking electronic logs. He worked efficiently but not carelessly. At one point, he looked up and met my gaze. I nodded politely. He gave a small nod back. That was the moment I realized he wasn't just an auditor. He was looking for something. The next morning, he lingered near the coffee machine while I organized appointment slips. He asked how long I'd been at Rosewood Pines. I said 2 months. Then I added, long enough to know something's off. He glanced at me for a beat, then quietly replied, "That's what I'm here to find out." We didn't speak more that day, but something had changed. A few evenings later, he knocked softly on the door of the media room while I was compiling my notes. "Mind if I sit for a second?" he asked. I gestured toward the other chair. We sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the computers filling the space. Then he asked, "Have you seen anything you think I should know about?" I reached into my bag and pulled out a flash drive. "Everything I've seen is on here." He raised an eyebrow but didn't take it. "What made you start looking into all this?" I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "Because my children left me here like I was a problem to solve. Because this place is supposed to take care of people and it doesn't. And because people like us don't have many chances to fight back." That night, I handed him the flash drive. He said thank you without smiling. The next week, things moved quickly. Inspectors began arriving more frequently. Minor repairs were suddenly a priority. Staff schedules were restructured. It was clear someone had applied pressure from above. I stayed quiet and kept watching. Noah would occasionally nod at me in passing, never drawing attention. One afternoon, I found a small envelope under my door. Inside was a single note. "You were right, and you're not alone." That simple message gave me more strength than I expected. I started speaking more openly with other residents. Carol and I compared notes. Mrs. Lynn from down the hall had copies of old maintenance requests that had never been fulfilled. A quiet man named Harold had been trying to reach his daughter for weeks, but the staff kept saying she hadn't called. I helped him write a letter. He received a response within 5 days. Word began to spread carefully that something was happening, that maybe we weren't as powerless as we'd been made to feel. Noah began spending more time with residents, asking quiet questions, noting their answers. The atmosphere shifted. Staff were more polite. Nurses seemed less hurried. The meals improved slightly. But we all knew the real changes weren't about kindness, they were about fear. Someone upstairs was worried. That made me feel something I hadn't felt in months. Control. Then came the call. Emma. Her voice was unusually soft, even hesitant. "Hi, Mum," she said. "Just calling to check in." I kept my tone even. "It's been a while." She stammered a little, apologized for being busy. Then came the real reason. "We've had some bad luck. Alex lost his job. I had to leave mine because of the kids. We had to move out of the townhouse." I said nothing. "We're staying with friends, but it's temporary," she continued, "and I was wondering if maybe we could stay with you, just until we get back on our feet." I took a long breath. Then I said, "I'm not at home anymore. Remember? You put me here." There was silence. Then a shaky whisper. "We didn't mean for it to be like this." I let the silence hang. Then I asked, "Why are you really calling me, Emma?" Her voice cracked. "Because we have nowhere else to go." I nodded slowly, though she couldn't see me. "That's unfortunate," I said. "I hope you find your way through." Then I ended the call. I stared at the phone in my lap for a long time. There it was, the moment I'd been waiting for. Not for revenge, not for cruelty, but for clarity. I no longer owed them anything. I was no longer their burden. They were finally facing the weight of their own choices, and I was finally free. Weeks passed after Emma's phone call, and I didn't hear from her or Alex again. It was as if the line had gone dead, but I knew better. They were likely scrambling, trying to patch the holes in the sinking ship they had built with their own arrogance and poor choices. I didn't feel joy in their downfall, only a distant sense of inevitability. I had once warned them about their reckless spending, their over-reliance on credit, the lifestyle they could not afford. They rolled their eyes at me, called me old-fashioned, said I didn't understand how things worked anymore. Apparently now they did. Meanwhile, life at Rosewood Pines continued shifting. Staff turnover had increased, especially among the managers. A quiet storm of internal audits, whistleblower tips, and external pressure had begun to dismantle the rotten core of the place. I never asked Noah for details, and he never offered any, but every day brought subtle improvements. Fresh fruit returned to the breakfast menu, leaking fixtures were repaired without delay. Most importantly, residents were being listened to. One morning, I stepped into the dining hall and saw Carol laughing, genuinely laughing, with 2 new residents over pancakes. It felt like something had cracked open, like we were allowed to breathe again. One afternoon I received a letter. No name on the envelope, just a return address scrawled in rushed handwriting. I opened it carefully. Inside was a note from Alex. He said he was sorry. He admitted they had made a mistake, that they should have never put me in the home, especially not on my birthday. He wrote that he had lost his job months ago, and they had been hiding the truth from everyone, pretending things were fine when they weren't. He confessed that he and Emma had fought, blamed each other, and were now living apart. She had taken the kids and moved into a friend's basement. He was staying on someone's couch. He asked if I had room for him, said he'd do anything to make it right. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. I didn't respond. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. But I was done giving pieces of myself to people who only showed up when they had nothing left to take. I had my own life to live now. That weekend I joined Carol and a few others on a day trip to the Botanical Gardens. It was something the facility had never offered before, part of a new wellness initiative. The bus ride was full of chatter and soft music. For the first time in months, I felt like a person again, not a forgotten obligation. As we walked through rows of tulips and sun-drenched paths, I realized something important. My life hadn't ended when I was left here. It had been paused, yes, but now it was beginning again in a new form. I was not what they left behind. I was what they failed to see. A few days later, I received a visit from a woman in a navy suit. She introduced herself as part of a legal team handling resident advocacy. "Your file was flagged for follow-up," she explained. "There are questions about whether your placement here involved proper legal procedure. Do you mind if we review it with you?" I welcomed her in. We talked for over an hour. I showed her the paperwork, explained the circumstances, and she nodded thoughtfully as she took notes. She didn't promise anything, but before she left she said, "You were right to raise concerns. Most people don't, but this matters." That evening I walked the garden path again, my usual route. It was late spring by then. The air was sweet with blossoms, and the sky was a watercolor wash of fading blue and pink. I thought about how much had changed in just a few months. I thought about my children, and how far they had fallen not because of misfortune, but because of who they had chosen to become. I had given them every chance. I had raised them with love, discipline, and sacrifice. But in the end they had abandoned me in favor of convenience. And when the tide turned, when life came for them the way it does for all of us, they had no foundation left. They had burned their bridges. All of them. I had no desire to rebuild those connections, not out of spite, but out of wisdom. Some relationships are not meant to be saved. Some endings are necessary. That night, as I lay in bed, I listened to the soft hum of the building. No sadness, no regret, just peace. Karma had arrived, not with a shout, but with silence, with eviction notices, broken credit, and empty bank accounts, and I had survived. More than that, I had endured with dignity and tact. They had thrown me away on my 65th birthday. Now they were homeless, broke, and alone. But I was finally home. A month after the letter from Alex arrived, Rosewood Pines looked nothing like the place I had first been left in. The change wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, almost elegant in its unfolding. There were fewer raised voices among the staff, fewer complaints whispered between residents. Carol had started a weekly poetry circle in the courtyard, and someone had even donated a set of watercolors for painting afternoons. I had found myself joining both, not because I needed the distraction, but because I finally wanted to be part of something again. My days filled with calm rituals, morning walks, shared coffee, small laughter. No one here asked what I could do for them. They asked if I wanted company, if I was up for a stroll, if I felt like joining the card game. No pressure, no guilt, just gentle invitations. I had spent 65 years running a household, raising children, budgeting meals, fixing what others broke. And now, for the first time in as long as I could remember, I had space to ask what I wanted for myself. I started journaling again, just a few pages every evening, filling the lined notebook I kept on my nightstand. I didn't write about my children or the betrayal or even the past much. I wrote about the smell of fresh lavender on the breeze, about the feeling of soil under my nails after planting herbs in the communal garden beds, about the small freedom in choosing my own schedule. One afternoon I got a phone call. It was from a reporter at a local newspaper. She had heard somehow about the recent changes at Rosewood Pines and the larger investigation into mismanagement of elder care facilities. She wanted to hear my story. At first I hesitated, but something inside me, some old, long-silenced voice told me to speak, not out of revenge, not out of bitterness, but because people needed to know what had happened and what still happens every day to people like me, forgotten, silenced, shelved. We met a week later at a nearby cafe. I told her everything, about the birthday abandonment, the manipulation, the months of loneliness, and the quiet turning point that had led me back to myself. She listened, took notes, and asked only thoughtful questions. When the article came out, it didn't use my full name, but the story was unmistakably mine. It went viral locally. The paper even followed it up with a series on elder neglect, featuring stories from others who had lived through similar betrayals. Rosewood Pines received a grant not long after, meant to support continued improvements. A new director was brought in, someone with a background in trauma-informed care. Things got better, and I, somehow, felt lighter. Then one morning I received a visit. It was a social worker, young but sharp. She had a folder in her hands and a cautious look in her eyes. She explained that based on the findings of the investigation, certain guardianship decisions might be eligible for review, including mine. It would mean you could petition for full autonomy, she said gently, to make your own medical and financial decisions again, without oversight. My heart thudded, not from fear, but from something deeper, hope. I hadn't realized how much I had adapted to being managed, how quietly I'd accepted the label of incapable. The process took weeks, assessments, interviews, hearings, but in the end the ruling came through. I was declared fully independent, capable, sovereign again. That evening I stood in front of the mirror in my room and looked at myself. 65, silver-haired, soft-lined, but not broken, not small. I had my name back, my voice, my rights, and no one could take them from me again. As summer deepened, I began volunteering at a local community centre. I shared my story at small workshops, met people who had lived through similar losses. Some cried, some raged, some just nodded quietly, as if finally seeing themselves reflected in someone else's experience. Healing wasn't loud, it was consistent, steady. I found it in every handshake, every shared laugh, every letter I received from strangers who said, "Thank you for telling the truth." I never heard from Alex again, or Emma, not since that letter. I imagined them moving from place to place, still blaming the world for the walls they ran into, never realizing those walls had been built with their own hands. I didn't hate them. I didn't forgive them either. I simply let go. I couldn't carry their weight anymore. It was never mine to hold. My life now was mine alone. One evening, Carol and I sat under the gazebo watching the sun set beyond the hedges. The sky turned gold, then rose, then purple. I turned to her and said, "You know, I thought being left here was the worst thing that had ever happened to me, but maybe it was the beginning of something better." She nodded, sipping her tea. Sometimes people have to fall apart to see what's still worth keeping. I smiled, breathing in the warm, quiet dusk. For the first time in years, I wasn't surviving for others. I was living for myself. By the time autumn arrived, the leaves had begun to change colour, painting rosewood pines in warm shades of amber and rust. Each morning, as I stepped outside for my daily walk, the crisp air reminded me that time was moving forward, just as I was. I had stopped counting the months since my children left me here. I no longer tracked the days on the calendar with dread or sorrow. The pain had become a quiet scar still there, but no longer open. One morning, a letter arrived at the front desk addressed to me. It wasn't from Alex or Emma, it was from the bank. Curious, I opened it and read the contents slowly. It was confirmation that my financial guardianship had been dissolved. I now had full control over my personal accounts and savings. I sat there for a long time holding the paper in my lap, not because of the numbers printed on it, but because of what it symbolized. I had been written off, discarded, and now, piece by piece, I was reclaiming everything they tried to erase. That same week, I took the bus into town and visited the small bookstore I used to frequent years ago. It had changed owners, but the bell above the door still jingled the same. As I walked the aisles, trailing my fingers over familiar spines, I realized how long it had been since I let myself enjoy something so simple. I bought a novel that day, a mystery, something light-hearted, and I read it every night before bed, losing myself in fiction instead of reliving the past. Around this time, a young woman named Maria moved into Rosewood Pines. She was a new nurse just out of school, full of bright ideas and kind smiles. She reminded me of someone I used to be eager to help, open-hearted, full of hope. One afternoon she sat beside me in the garden and asked about my life, not just the recent years, but before. My childhood, my career, my dreams. I found myself telling her stories I hadn't shared in decades, not because I was hiding them, but because no one had asked. She listened, truly listened, and when I finished she said, "You should write this down. People need to hear it." So I did, not in grand declarations but in quiet chapters, pages tucked away in a binder I kept by my bed. It became my project, my purpose, not to seek validation but to reclaim my voice. One evening during a resident gathering, Carol encouraged me to share one of the stories. I read a short passage aloud just a few minutes, but the room fell silent. When I finished, there were no questions, just gentle applause, and for the first time in years I felt seen, not as a burden or a leftover, but as a person with history, with depth, with something to give. That night, I added a new entry to my journal. It simply read, "I matter." A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at the community library as part of a series on resilience. The organizer had read the article that had been published months earlier. She wanted me to talk about starting over, about being discarded and choosing to rise anyway. I said yes, not because I craved the spotlight, but because if even one person in that room felt the way I had felt, forgotten, used, silenced, then maybe my words could be a small light in their darkness. On the day of the talk, I wore my best dress, pinned my hair neatly, and stood at the podium with shaking hands but a steady voice. I spoke not just about betrayal, but about recovery, about finding meaning after loss, identity after abandonment. I told them the truth, that healing wasn't immediate or pretty or even certain, but it was possible. When I finished, there was a pause, then someone clapped, then another, and then the whole room. Later, a woman my age approached me, tears in her eyes. She hugged me without asking and whispered, "Thank you, I thought I was the only one." That moment stayed with me for days. I realized then that survival isn't about getting through, it's about choosing what you become afterward. My children may have left me. They may have taken my trust, my years, and tried to take my dignity. But they didn't get the last word. I did. I was no longer the woman they abandoned. I was someone new, stronger, wiser, untethered from their cruelty. And every morning I woke up, took a deep breath, and lived a life they never imagined I could, not in spite of them, but free from them. The morning began like any other. I brewed my tea, folded my blanket neatly at the edge of the bed, and opened the window to let in the crisp morning breeze. But there was something different in the air, an energy I couldn't quite name. As I walked down the hall to breakfast, Carol stopped me, her eyes wide with quiet urgency. "You have visitors," she said. "They're waiting in the lobby." I didn't have to ask who. I already knew. My pace slowed, but my heart didn't race. Not like it used to. No panic, no trembling, just curiosity. When I turned the corner, there they were, Alex and Emma. They looked older than I remembered, though it had only been a year. Stress had carved lines across their faces, and their clothes hung on them in ways that suggested financial struggle. Emma clutched a worn handbag against her chest, like it was the last valuable thing she owned. Alex stood stiffly beside her, eyes scanning the room as if searching for something solid to lean on. I stopped a few feet away, letting the silence stretch between us. Finally, Alex spoke. "Hi, Mum." I tilted my head slightly, not out of warmth, but to study him. "What brings you here?" Emma stepped forward, voice uncertain. We've had a rough time." I waited. I wasn't about to make it easy for them. Alex looked down at his shoes. "The house was foreclosed. We lost the apartment after that. Jobs fell through. We didn't know where else to go." I still didn't say a word. I simply stared at the two people who had celebrated my 65th birthday by dumping me here with boxes packed and a smile that barely masked their eagerness to be free of me. Emma's voice cracked. "We made a mistake, Mum, a big one. We see that now. We were selfish and blind and cruel." Her eyes filled with tears. "We were wrong. We're sorry." For a moment I looked past them, at the sliding glass doors, the soft hum of the heater, the staff moving quietly through the halls. This place, once a prison in my mind, had become a sanctuary, not because it was perfect, but because I had reclaimed it. I had built something here, relationships, routine, peace, and now these two people who once called me a burden had come crawling back. But this wasn't about revenge. It never had been. This was about closure. I met Emma's eyes. "Do you remember what you told me that day? That it was time for me to stop depending on you? That I should enjoy my golden years quietly?" She nodded, ashamed. I looked at Alex. "And you? You said I had lived enough and that you needed space to build your own legacy." He flinched. "We were arrogant," he admitted. "We thought we knew everything." I nodded slowly. "And what is it you want from me now?" Emma's voice was barely audible. "We don't have anywhere else to go. We thought maybe we could stay with you, just until we get back on our feet." I almost laughed, not out of cruelty, but at the stunning symmetry of life. I had needed shelter once too. I had needed their patience, their compassion, their belief in me. Instead, they gave me silence, distance, abandonment. I stepped forward slightly, close enough for them to hear every word clearly. You see, I did get back on my feet. I found my footing, my peace, my dignity. Without you. Alex's jaw tightened. So that's it? You're going to turn your back on us like we did to you? I shook my head. No, I'm simply choosing myself, just like you did. Emma began to sob. Not loudly, but with that soft, defeated kind of weeping that comes when the last thread of denial snaps. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small envelope. Inside is a list of shelters, food banks, and job placement centres. It's a start. Alex looked at the envelope like it was a curse. You're serious? Completely. I placed it on the chair beside me. What you do next is your decision. But my chapter with you, it's finished. I turned without another word and walked back toward the dining hall. Carol was waiting near the doorway, a quiet question in her eyes. Just old ghosts, I said with a small smile. They don't live here anymore. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees and golden light spilled across my journal, I wrote the final entry in the binder I had been filling since the day I arrived. They came back expecting shelter from the same woman they cast aside. But this woman is no longer a shadow of who she was. I forgave them in silence, not for their sake but for mine. I'm not their lifeline. I am my own. I closed the journal, set it on the shelf and turned toward the window. The sky was clear, the stars beginning to peek through. The night held no fear, only freedom.